The silence in the house was the first thing that struck any visitor. It wasn't a peaceful silence, not the quiet contentment of a sleeping home. It was a heavy, suffocating thing, thick with unspoken words and cushioned by rugs that absorbed every footstep. The air itself seemed sterile, scrubbed clean of any joyful noise, carrying only the faint, antiseptic scent of cleaning solutions and the low, rhythmic hum of an air purifier in the corner. This was not a home. It was a waiting room for a future that had been stolen. Clara moved through this silence like a ghost in her own life. Her motions were practiced, economical, stripped of all wasted energy. It was 10:30 a.m. Time for Leo's first set of physical therapy exercises. She entered the nursery, a room painted in soft yellows and blues that now felt like a cruel joke. On the wall, cheerful cartoon animals frolicked in a painted jungle, their painted limbs full of a life her son would never know. Leo lay in his crib, a small, perfect doll with wide, curious blue eyes that followed his mother's every move. He was beautiful, with a soft dusting of golden hair that caught the morning light. He could smile, a heart-stopping, gummy grin that was Clara's only son. He could gurgle and coo, but from his tiny waist down, he was perfectly, terrifyingly still. "Hello, my sweet boy," Clara whispered, her voice a soft rustle of leaves in the quiet room. She leaned over the crib, and Leo's face lit up. That smile was a double-edged sword. It filled her with a fierce, protective love while simultaneously shattering her heart all over again. She gently lifted him, her hands expertly supporting his head and his unresponsive lower body. They had a routine, a meticulous dance of stretches and movements designed to prevent his muscles from atrophying completely. She laid him on the soft mat on the floor and began. Her touch gentle, but firm. She bent his knees, rotated his ankles, massaged his small, still thighs. He watched her, his eyes full of innocent trust, unaware that his own body was a prison. Each movement was a reminder of the accident. The word echoed in her mind, clinical and insufficient. A fall. A simple, horrifying fall from his changing table 3 months ago. The nanny, a young, flustered girl, had sworn she'd only turned her back for a second. 1 second. A 1 in a million tragedy. The doctors had said, a spinal cord injury so severe, so high up in a baby so young. They had offered diagnoses and prognoses, all couched in careful, sympathetic language that amounted to one brutal fact: Leo would never walk. Her husband, Mark, dealt with the finality of it all by clinging to structure. He managed the schedules, the appointments, the insurance paperwork. He read every medical journal, every experimental study, his grief channeled into a desperate intellectual search for a cure that didn't exist. He talked about Leo's condition and prognosis, his language becoming as sterile as their home. He couldn't bear to look at the vibrant, happy baby and see the brokenness. It was easier to see a problem to be managed. At night, they lay side by side in bed, separated by a chasm of their shared, yet separate, grief. The silence was loudest there. It had been Mark's idea to get the puppy, to bring some life back into the house. He'd said, his eyes avoiding hers. For Leo, it'll be good for him. Clara had resisted. A puppy was chaos, noise, mess, everything their carefully controlled world was designed to keep out. It felt like another burden, another living thing she would have to care for when all her energy was already poured into the black hole of Leo's needs. But Mark had insisted. And one afternoon, he came home with a small, wriggling ball of golden fluff. A golden retriever puppy with paws too big for his body and sad, soulful eyes. They named him Buddy. For the first week, Clara's predictions were correct. Buddy chewed on the leg of a chair, had an accident on the expensive rug, and yapped at shadows. He was a creature of pure, unadulterated life, and his energy felt like an intrusion, a violation of the home's sacred sorrow. But then, a strange thing happened. The puppy seemed to understand. He learned, with an intelligence that seemed far beyond his 8 weeks of age, that the nursery was a quiet space. He would enter, and his frantic puppy energy would melt away. He wouldn't jump or bark. Instead, he would pad softly over to Leo's mat or crib and lie down. A a warm, breathing presence. He became Leo's furry shadow. When Clara did the exercises, Buddy would rest his chin on his paws and watch, his tail giving a soft, slow thump 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 against the floor. When Leo was in his crib, Buddy would sleep beneath it, a self-appointed guardian. Now, as Clara finished the last stretch, she felt the familiar weight of exhaustion settle deep into her bones. She bundled Leo in a soft blanket and held him close, humming a tuneless lullaby. Her eyes drifted to the doorway. Buddy was there, watching them, his head cocked to one side. He padded into the room and settled near her feet, letting out a soft sigh as if to say, "I'm here." Clara looked from her son's peaceful face to the devoted puppy at her feet. For the first time in a long time, the silence in the room didn't feel empty. It felt watched over. A single hot tear escaped her eye and traced a path down her cheek. It wasn't a tear of pure sorrow, but something more complex. It was a tear for the life they had lost, but also for this small, unexpected flicker of warmth, this tiny, breathing comfort in the vast, cold weight of her reality. Buddy's devotion to Leo quickly became the new, quiet rhythm of the household. It was a source of constant, gentle amazement to Clara. The puppy seemed to possess an empathy that defied his animal nature. He never barked when Leo was sleeping. He learned to differentiate the sound of the front door from the sound of Clara's footsteps near the nursery, remaining silent for one while letting out a happy little woof for the other. His toys, soft and squeakless, were often found piled neatly beside Leo's playmat, not as an invitation to play, but as an offering. This behavior was a small comfort to Clara, but a significant one. It was a tangible sign of love in a house that had grown cold with grief. Mark, too, saw it and was grateful. "See, I told you it was a good idea," he'd say, managing a faint smile as he watched Buddy rest his furry head on the edge of Leo's crib, as if listening to the baby's soft breathing. For Mark, Buddy's presence was proof that one of his decisions had turned out right in a world where everything had gone wrong. The fragile peace was disturbed, as it often was, by the arrival of family. Specifically, Mark's brother, Ethan. Ethan was everything Mark was not. Where Mark had grown quiet and withdrawn, Ethan was loud, charming, and filled every room with his confident energy. He was handsome, successful, and always seemed to know the right thing to say. He visited often, always bearing extravagant gifts and filling the oppressive silence with stories of his business deals and social life. Clara knew he meant well, that his visits were a lifeline for Mark, a connection to the man he used to be. But to her, Ethan's boisterous presence felt like a disruption, a loud noise in a library of pain. He arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, letting himself in with the key Mark had given him. "Hello, family." His voice boomed from the foyer. Mark's face lit up with a genuine relief that pained Clara to see. "Ethan, in here." Buddy, who had been dozing at Clara's feet in the living room, lifted his head. His tail gave a few lazy thumps on the floor. Ethan strode in, impeccably dressed, a broad smile on his face. He clapped Mark on the shoulder, then turned to Clara, his expression softening into one of practiced sympathy. "Clara, how are you holding up? You look tired. You need to take care of yourself." He squeezed her arm gently. "I'm fine. Ethan, thanks for coming." The words were automatic, a script she had learned by heart. "Nonsense. And where's my little champion?" he asked, his voice bright. "I've got to see him." As Ethan started towards the hallway that led to the nursery, the thumping of Buddy's tail stopped. It was an abrupt absence of sound that Clara registered subconsciously. The puppy rose to his feet, his body suddenly losing its relaxed, sleepy posture. He was alert, tense. Clara watched him, a small frown creasing her brow. "Buddy, stay," she said softly. But the puppy ignored her. He trotted ahead of Ethan, his gait stiff, and stood squarely in the doorway of the nursery. Ethan chuckled. "Well, look at this. The palace guard is on duty." He reached down to pat Buddy's head, but the puppy sidestepped the touch, his eyes fixed on Ethan. A low sound, barely audible, rumbled in his chest. It wasn't a bark or a yap. It was a deep, guttural growl that Clara had never heard him make before. "Whoa there, fella," Ethan said, pulling his hand back, his smile unwavering. "Protective little guy, isn't he?" Mark came up behind them. "He's bonded with Leo. It's amazing to watch. Buddy, come on, boy. It's just Uncle Ethan." Buddy didn't move. He held his ground, a small, furry sentinel, his body a rigid line of defiance. He wasn't being aggressive, not in a way that suggested an attack. He was being a barrier. Clara felt a strange prickle of unease. "Buddy, enough," she said, her voice firmer this time. She walked over and took him by the collar. The fur on his neck was raised. She had to tug him gently to the side to allow Ethan to pass into the room. Ethan went over to the crib. His charm switched back onto full power. "There he is. Hey there, Leo. Look at you. Getting so big. Uncle Ethan is so proud of you." He leaned over the crib, his shadow falling over the sleeping baby. From his position by Clara's side, Buddy's growl intensified. It was still low, a vibration more than a sound, but it was filled with a palpable animosity. He strained against Clara's grip, his eyes never leaving Ethan's form. "My God, this dog." Ethan laughed, shaking his head as he straightened up. "You'd think I was the big bad wolf. You're doing too good a job, boy." Clara forced a smile, feeling a flush of embarrassment. "I'm so sorry. Ethan. He's never done this before. He must just be... I don't know. Maybe it's your aftershave." It was a weak excuse, and she knew it. But it was easier than confronting the strange, unsettling feeling in her gut. She tightened her grip on Buddy's collar, her mind racing. It was just a puppy being a puppy. Dogs were weird sometimes. They took dislikes to people for no reason. It meant nothing. But as Ethan finished his visit and left the house, filling the silence once more with his booming farewells, Clara couldn't shake the image from her mind. Buddy immediately relaxed, padded over to the crib, and laid his head down, letting out a soft sigh. He was a guardian. Yes. But his behavior hadn't been just protective. It had been accusatory. And it was aimed at only one person. A week passed, and the memory of Buddy's strange behavior toward Ethan began to fade. Dismissed by Clara as a peculiar one-off event, life settled back into its monotonous rhythm of care and quiet endurance. The days were long, blurring into one another, marked only by feeding times and therapy sessions. On a particularly grueling Thursday afternoon, Leo was inconsolable. He was teething, and his frustration, unable to be expressed through kicking or moving, came out in wave after wave of distressed, painful cries. Clara had tried everything: teething rings, gentle gum massages, endless rocking. Her own nerves were frayed raw, her body aching with an exhaustion so deep it felt like it had settled in her bones. Mark was stuck in a series of meetings at work, leaving her to weather the storm alone. Finally, after what felt like an eternity. Leo's cries subsided into whimpers, his small body going limp against her shoulder as he finally surrendered to a restless sleep. Carefully, as if handling the most delicate piece of glass, Clara lowered him into his crib. She stood over him for a long moment, her hand resting on his back, waiting to be sure he was truly asleep. The silence that descended was a blessing, a fragile peace she was desperate to preserve. She tiptoed out of the nursery, leaving the door slightly ajar, and sank onto the living room sofa, closing her eyes. At her feet, Buddy, who had been a silent witness to the entire ordeal, let out a sympathetic sigh. She must have dozed off, for the sound of the front door opening startled her awake. It was Ethan. He was a silhouette in the doorway, holding a bag from an expensive bakery. "Just dropping by," he announced cheerfully, his voice softer than usual. "Heard from Mark that you guys were having a rough day. Thought you could use some pastries and a friendly face." Clara's heart sank a little. Her precious quiet shattered, but she forced a grateful smile. "Ethan, you didn't have to." "Thank you. Of course I did. How's the little guy? Did he finally settle down?" "He just fell asleep. I think the worst of it is over." "Poor kid. Let me just peek in on him. I won't make a sound." Before Clara could respond, he was already moving down the hallway. Buddy, who had been lying peacefully, was instantly on his feet. The transformation was jarring. His body went rigid, a low growl rumbling in his chest, far more menacing than the one from the week before. "Buddy, no," Clara whispered urgently, but the puppy was already in motion. He didn't just stand in the doorway this time. As Ethan reached the threshold of the nursery, preparing to step inside, Buddy launched himself forward. It happened in a flash of golden fur and bared teeth. He didn't leap to bite, but to block. He landed squarely in front of Ethan, his paws skidding on the hardwood floor, his body a solid, immovable wall. A ferocious, terrifying snarl ripped from his throat, echoing in the silent house. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated warning. Ethan stumbled back, his face a mask of shock and fear. "Jesus Christ, Clara. What the hell is wrong with your dog?" Clara scrambled off the sofa, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Buddy, stop it. Get back here. Now." The puppy ignored her, his entire focus locked on the man in the hallway. His lips were curled back, revealing a startlingly white set of teeth. Every muscle in his small body was coiled like a spring. He was protecting the entrance to the nursery, as if he were guarding the gates of a fortress. "He's gone crazy," Ethan yelled, his voice laced with indignation. "He tried to attack me." "He didn't," Clara said automatically, though she wasn't sure. She grabbed Buddy's collar, her hand trembling. The puppy was vibrating with contained rage. "Buddy, down." She had to physically haul him back, his paws scraping against the floor as he resisted, his eyes never leaving Ethan. "I was just going to look at my nephew," Ethan said, his hand on his chest as if to calm his own racing heart. "Clara, this isn't safe. A dog that aggressive, with a baby in the house. You need to do something about this. I'm so sorry," she stammered, dragging the still growling puppy into the living room. "I don't know what's gotten into him. He's never, ever like this." She managed to get Buddy to lie down, though he remained tense, his head raised, watching the hallway. Ethan stood his ground for a moment, his charming demeanor completely gone, replaced by a cold anger. But then, as if catching himself, he smoothed his expression, forcing a shaky laugh. "Well, he certainly gave me a scare. Look, I'll just leave these here," he said, placing the pastry bag on the console table. "You've clearly got your hands full. We'll talk later." He gave her a tight, unsmiling nod and left, the front door closing with a soft, final click. The silence that returned was different. It was electric, humming with the aftershock of the confrontation. Clara stared at the hallway, her mind replaying the scene over and over. The speed of the dog, the ferocity of the snarl, the absolute certainty of his purpose. He hadn't been trying to attack. She realized that with a sudden, chilling clarity. He had been intervening. He had put his body between her sleeping, vulnerable son and the man who was about to enter the room. Her excuse from last time, "maybe it's his aftershave," felt pathetic and foolish now. This was not a random dislike. This was a targeted, specific hostility, reserved only for Ethan, and triggered only when he approached Leo. She sank back onto the sofa, her body cold despite the warmth of the room. She looked at Buddy, who was now panting softly. The crisis over. He met her gaze, his dark, soulful eyes full of a strange, knowing intelligence. He had done his job. Then, a thought, cold and venomous, slithered into her mind. A thought so monstrous, so unthinkable, that she felt a wave of nausea. She tried to push it away, to banish it. It was the thought of a grieving, paranoid mother. It was crazy, but it wouldn't leave. It took root, wrapping its tendrils around her heart. What if the dog sees something I don't? She stood up and walked on trembling legs to the nursery. Leo was still asleep, his face peaceful, his chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm. He was so helpless, so completely dependent on her to protect him. The official story of the accident played in her head. The nanny's momentary lapse, the fall, a one-in-a-million tragedy. But Buddy's snarl echoed louder. For the first time since that horrible day, a new question pierced through the fog of her grief, sharp and terrifying and impossible to ignore. What if it wasn't an accident? Sleep offered no escape. The monstrous question that had bloomed in Clara's mind. What if it wasn't an accident followed her into her dreams? She tossed and turned, caught in nightmarish loops of falling objects and the sound of a vicious, snarling dog. The silence of her home, Once a symbol of her grief, now felt menacing. Every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of the wind outside, seemed to hold a secret. She would look at her husband, Mark, sleeping beside her, his face etched with sorrow even in slumber, and a wall of ice would form around her heart. How could she even begin to voice a suspicion so vile about his own brother? The question festered for days. It was a poison, tainting every interaction. When she cared for Leo, her hands would tremble slightly. She was his protector, yet she felt she had failed him in some fundamental way, blindly accepting a story that a simple animal had the sense to reject. The puppy, Buddy, seemed to be her only ally in this new, terrifying reality. He would watch her with his dark, knowing eyes, as if waiting for her to catch up to what he already knew. Finally, she couldn't bear the torment of the unknown any longer. One afternoon, while Leo was napping and Buddy was a warm, solid presence at her feet, she made a decision. She had to go back. She had to walk through the memories she had so carefully barricaded behind a wall of trauma and grief. She sat at the kitchen table, a cup of cold tea forgotten in her hands, and forced her mind to return to that day, the day of the fall. The memories were fragmented, shrouded in the fog of panic. The frantic call from the nanny, Jessica. The screech of tires as she sped to the hospital. The blinding white lights of the emergency room. Mark, collapsing into a chair, his face ashen. A hollowed-out man. Her own parents. Her in-laws. Their faces a blur of tears and disbelief. And Ethan, as she focused on him, a strange detail emerged from the fog, sharp and clear. Amid the maelstrom of hysteria, Ethan had been calm, unnervingly calm. At the time, she had registered it as strength. He was the one holding it together, speaking to the nurses in a firm, steady voice, getting cups of water for everyone. His face a mask of grim concern. He had comforted his weeping parents, put a steadying arm around his crumbling brother. But now, re-examining that memory, Clara saw it differently. It wasn't the calm of a man trying to be strong for his family. It was the detached composure of an observer. There had been no raw panic in his eyes, no gut-wrenching terror. He had been efficient. The thought sent a chill down her spine. It was a tiny crack in the facade, but it was there. She dug deeper, pushing past the hospital, searching her memory for the weeks leading up to the accident. It was a normal time, filled with the happy chaos of a new baby. Or was it? Another memory surfaced, unbidden. A family dinner, about a week before Leo's fall. The whole family was there, celebrating her father-in-law's birthday. The mood was light, full of laughter and wine. The conversation had drifted to talk of the future, of legacy. Her father-in-law, raising a glass, had made a toast. "To my son, Mark," he'd said, his voice thick with emotion, "and to my grandson, Leo. The family legacy is in good hands." Everyone had smiled and clinked glasses. Everyone except Ethan. He had a tight, strange smile on his face. He'd swirled the wine in his glass and said, his voice dripping with a sarcasm that only Clara seemed to notice, "Well, the main line of succession is secure now, isn't it? The rest of us can just fight over the scraps." There was an awkward silence. Mark had laughed it off. "Oh, come on. Ethan, don't be like that." His mother had scolded him gently. The moment passed, dismissed as one of Ethan's typically sour jokes about being the younger brother. But Clara remembered the look in his eyes. It wasn't a joke. It was pure, unadulterated bitterness. It was the curdled envy of a man who felt he'd been cheated. The main line of succession is secure now. The words echoed in her mind, now loaded with a horrifying new weight. What happens when that line is broken? A paralyzed child. A child who might not live to adulthood. A child whose medical care could drain a fortune. Would that not disrupt the succession? Clara stood up from the table, her body trembling. The calm observer at the hospital. The bitter comment about inheritance. And a dog who would risk anything to keep that same man away from her child. Individually, they were oddities. Uncomfortable moments that could be explained away. But woven together, they formed the tapestry of a nightmare. The seeds of doubt, planted by a puppy's growl, were no longer just seeds. They were sprouting, growing into a grotesque certainty that choked her. The grief that had paralyzed her for months began to transform, hardening into something else. It was cold, sharp, and clear. It was anger. A quiet, focused rage began to burn where the sorrow had been. She was no longer just a grieving mother. She was a protector who had been asleep at her post. She looked down at Buddy, who thumped his tail against the floor as if in encouragement. She had to know. She couldn't build her son's future, or her own, on the foundation of a potential lie. For Leo, she had to uncover the truth, no matter how monstrous it might be. Clara's anger was a quiet, cold thing, but it was potent. It gave her a clarity she hadn't possessed in months. The fog of grief had lifted, replaced by a sharp, singular focus. Find the truth. She knew she couldn't confront Mark. Not yet. He was still too deep in his sorrow, too wrapped up in his unwavering trust for his brother. She couldn't go to the police with something as flimsy as a dog's intuition and a reinterpreted memory. She needed proof, something tangible, something undeniable. Her investigation had to start at the epicenter of their tragedy, the nursery. She waited for the perfect moment. Mark was at the office, a long day of meetings ahead of him. Leo, after his morning feed and therapy, was settled in for his longest nap of the day. The house was still, but for Clara, it was a different kind of silence now. It was the charged silence of a hunter on the prowl. With Buddy trotting silently at her heels, she walked into the nursery and closed the door behind her. Her heart hammered against her ribs. For months, this room had been a place of sadness and duty. Now, it was a crime scene. She started with the changing table. It was a heavy, solid piece of oak furniture. She pushed against it, testing for any wobble or instability that could have contributed to a fall. There was none. It was anchored securely to the wall, a precaution Mark had insisted upon. She ran her hands over its smooth surface, her eyes scanning every inch. Nothing. Next, she got on her hands and knees, her gaze sweeping across the floorboards. The police had done a cursory examination, but they were investigating an accident, not a crime. They wouldn't have been looking for subtleties. Clara was. She searched for scuff marks, scratches, anything out of place. Buddy, seeming to sense the gravity of her task, lay down near the door, his head on his paws, watching her with an intense focus. She spent nearly an hour searching, her initial resolve beginning to waver, replaced by a creeping self-doubt. Was she losing her mind? Was she so desperate for an explanation, for someone to blame, that she was manufacturing a conspiracy out of thin air? She sat back on her heels, the frustration stinging her eyes. Nothing. There was nothing here. Defeated, she pushed herself up. As she did, her hand pressed down hard on the thick, plush rug that covered the center of the room. And she felt it, a small, hard lump beneath the dense fibers. Her breath caught in her throat. It wasn't a toy. She knew the shape and feel of every one of Leo's things. This was different. Small, sharp-edged. With trembling fingers, she began to work at the edge of the heavy rug, peeling it back. It was slow, difficult work. The rug was weighed down by the crib and a bookshelf. But she finally managed to lift a corner, exposing the dark wood floor beneath. And there it was, lying in the dust, almost invisible against the dark wood, was a small, metallic object. She picked it up. It was a cufflink, or rather, half of one. The main, decorative face was there, but the toggle part on the back had been snapped off, leaving a rough, broken edge. It was made of polished silver with fine, intricate lines etched into its surface, forming a stylized, elegant letter. The letter E. Clara's blood ran cold. She didn't have to guess where it came from. The image flashed in her mind, vivid and immediate. A blue velvet box. The celebration for Ethan's 30th birthday last year. She and Mark had searched for weeks for the perfect gift, finally settling on a pair of bespoke silver cufflinks from a designer he admired. She remembered tracing the elegant E with her finger before they wrapped the box. It was a unique, unmistakable design. She stood there, frozen. The broken piece of metal digging into her palm. Her mind raced, connecting the dots with horrifying speed. The official story, the one the nanny, Jessica, had told the police through her sobs, was that she had been alone in the room with Leo. She had turned to grab a diaper, and in that single second, he had rolled and fallen. She had been adamant. No one else was there, but this cufflink was proof that she had lied. It was proof that Ethan had been in this room. He must have stood right here, on this spot, and the fact that the cufflink was broken suggested a struggle, a sudden, forceful movement. It had been snagged, ripped from his shirt cuff, and had fallen here, under the rug, where it lay hidden for months. A tiny, silent witness. This was it, the first loose thread. Clara closed her fist around the cold, hard proof. The doubt was gone, incinerated by a white-hot certainty. Her brother-in-law had been in this room on the day her son was crippled. He had lied about it. And he had made sure the nanny lied about it, too. She looked at her sleeping, innocent son, then down at the loyal dog who had been the catalyst for this revelation. A fierce, protective fire ignited within her. This was no longer just a suspicion. This was a hunt. And she had just found the trail. Clara sat on the floor of the nursery for a long time, the broken cufflink a cold, heavy weight in her hand. It was proof. Yes, but it was also a declaration of war against her own family. The path forward was terrifying and shrouded in darkness. She couldn't walk it alone. Going to Mark was out of the question. He revered his brother. Presenting him with this flimsy piece of metal and a story about a clairvoyant puppy would sound like madness born of grief. He would defend Ethan, and the chasm between them would become an unbridgeable canyon. The police would be even more dismissive. This wasn't enough to reopen a case that had been officially closed as a domestic accident. She needed more. She needed help. There was only one person she could trust completely. One person who possessed the unique combination of fierce loyalty and professional skepticism that this situation demanded. Her best friend, Maya. Maya was a journalist, and a damn good one. She had a mind like a steel trap and a bullshit detector that was second to none. She had been Clara's rock through the initial trauma of Leo's accident, but Clara had since retreated, not wanting to burden her friend with the monotonous misery of her daily life. Now, she needed her not just as a friend, but for the skills her profession had honed. She called her voice more strained than she intended. "Maya, can we meet? It's important." Maya didn't hesitate. "My place? Half an hour." Clara found a small, velvet pouch for the cufflink, tucked it deep into her pocket, and drove to Maya's apartment with a sense of both dread and relief. The weight of the secret was crushing her, and she prayed she wasn't about to make a terrible mistake. Maya opened the door, her sharp, intelligent eyes immediately scanning Clara's face with concern. "You look like you've seen a ghost," she said, pulling her into a hug before leading her to the sofa. "Talk to me. See, what's going on?" Clara's resolve faltered. Now that she was here, about to say the words out loud for the first time, they sounded insane. She took a deep breath. "Maya, you're going to think I'm crazy." "Try me," Maya said, her gaze steady and patient. Hesitantly at first, then with a torrent of pent-up fear and conviction, Clara told her everything. She started with Buddy, his inexplicable, targeted aggression towards Ethan. She recounted the ferocious lunge, the way the puppy had physically blocked the nursery door. She spoke of the memories that had resurfaced Ethan's chilling composure at the hospital, his bitter, possessive comment about the family inheritance. Maya listened without interruption, her journalistic instincts kicking in. Her expression was unreadable, her posture attentive. She was absorbing the information, filing it away. "I know how it sounds," Clara said, her voice cracking. A grieving mother, projecting blame, using her dog as an excuse. "Mark thinks I'm just stressed, that I'm becoming paranoid." "What does your gut tell you?" Maya asked quietly. "My gut tells me something is terribly wrong," Clara whispered. "And I found something." She reached into her pocket, her hand trembling as she pulled out the velvet pouch. She tipped its contents into her palm. The broken silver cufflink glinted under the light of Maya's lamp. "I found this today, under the rug in the nursery, deep under the rug, where it couldn't have been kicked by accident." Maya leaned forward, her eyes narrowing. She picked up the cufflink, turning it over in her fingers. Is this? It's Ethan's, Clara confirmed. We gave them to him for his 30th. I'm certain of it. And look, it's broken. This was the turning point. The story about the dog was anecdotal. The memories were subjective. But this was evidence. A physical object that placed Ethan in a room he swore he never entered that day. A broken object that suggested force. Maya was silent for a full minute, her gaze fixed on the piece of silver. Clara could almost see the tumblers clicking into place in her mind. She was no longer just a concerned friend. She was a journalist sniffing out the anatomy of a lie. The nanny, Jessica, Maya said, her voice low and serious. The official report says she was the only one in the room. Exactly. Clara breathed, relief flooding her. Maya believed her, so she lied. Maya stated, not as a question, but as a fact. Which means Ethan was there. And if he was there, and they both lied about it, there's a reason. Maya looked up, her eyes locking with Clara's. The skepticism was gone, replaced by a cold, hard fire that mirrored Clara's own. Okay, she said, her voice firm. Okay, Clara, I'm with you. You're not crazy. Clara let out a sob she hadn't realized she was holding. The relief so profound it was painful. She was no longer alone in the darkness. This cufflink is a start, Maya continued, her mind already moving ahead, formulating a plan. But it's not enough. A good lawyer would argue he lost it on a previous visit. We need more. We need to corroborate the lie. She tapped her finger on the table. We need to find the nanny. We need to find out why she would lie for him. The fear was still there, a cold knot in Clara's stomach. But for the first time in months, it was joined by something else, a flicker of hope. She had an ally, and her ally had a plan. The hunt had truly begun. Having an ally changed everything. The secret was still a terrifying burden, but it was now a shared one. While Clara focused on maintaining a fragile peace at home, Maya began the methodical, behind-the-scenes work of a seasoned journalist. She started by running background checks, searching social media, and tapping into databases to find a digital footprint for the former nanny. Jessica. The initial search was fruitless. It was as if she had vanished. Meanwhile, at home, the atmosphere grew thick with a new kind of tension. Ethan must have sensed the shift in Clara. Her grief, once a passive, heavy fog, had been replaced by a quiet, watchful intensity. She no longer looked at him with just sadness, but with a sharp, analytical gaze he wasn't used to. He clearly didn't know what she had found, but he knew something had changed, and his reaction was not to retreat, but to advance. He doubled down on his role as the concerned, doting uncle. His visits became more frequent, almost daily. He brought gourmet meals, insisting Clara was too tired to cook. He bought expensive sensory toys for Leo, explaining to Mark in detail how they would help with his cognitive development. He was a constant, suffocating presence. His charm turned up to a blinding wattage. To Mark, Ethan was a saint, a brother going above and beyond. To Clara, his every gesture felt like a strategic move on a battlefield she hadn't known she was fighting on. His true strategy, she soon realized, was to isolate her by poisoning the well of Mark's trust. He did it with surgical precision, using sympathy as his scalpel. One evening, after Ethan had brought over a lavish dinner, he caught Mark alone in the kitchen. Clara, putting Leo to bed, overheard their conversation from the hallway, her body going rigid. She seems a little better today, Mark said, a hopeful note in his voice. Ethan sighed, a deep, performative sound of concern. On the surface, maybe, but I'm worried about her. Mark, I see the way she looks at people, the way she's so on edge. This kind of trauma, it can do strange things to a person's mind. It can breed paranoia. Make you see shadows where there are none. Paranoia. Mark's voice was defensive. She's just protective. Of course. Of course. And she's an incredible mother, Ethan said smoothly, backtracking just enough. I just mean, don't be surprised if she starts acting irrationally. It's a classic symptom of unresolved trauma. The most important thing is for you to be your rock, to gently guide her back to reality if she starts to drift. Clara felt sick. He was preemptively discrediting her. He was building a narrative where any accusation she might make would be dismissed as a symptom of mental instability. He was painting her as a fragile, hysterical woman before she even had a chance to speak. The dog became a focal point of his campaign. Buddy's low growl was a constant, humming threat whenever Ethan was in the house. The puppy refused to be in the same room, often standing in the hallway, a tense, furry sentinel. Ethan began to use this to his advantage. You see, he'd say to Mark with a shake of his head, "That dog is not stable. His aggression is a reflection of the tension in this house. Clara's tension? It's worrying." He was twisting the truth with masterful skill. The one honest creature in the house was being framed as an extension of her supposed paranoia. Clara had to play the most difficult role of her life. She forced herself to smile, to thank Ethan for his generosity, to act the part of the grateful, grieving wife. Inside, she was a knot of cold fury. Every conversation was a chess match. His feigned concern felt like a physical threat. His presence a contamination of her home. The air crackled with the unspoken truth whenever he was near. She could feel him watching her, trying to gauge how much she knew, while she watched him right back, searching for another crack in his perfect facade. One night, as he was leaving, he put a hand on her shoulder. His smile was kind, but his eyes were cold and hard as steel. "You're doing a great job, Clara," he said, his voice low. "But don't let your imagination run away with you. It would be a shame to let unfounded fears tear this family apart when we've already been through so much." It wasn't a word of comfort. It was a threat, a clear, unmistakable warning to back off. She closed the door behind him, her hand trembling. He knew. He didn't know what she knew, but he knew she was a threat. He was no longer just a man with a secret. He was an active adversary, working to build a cage of doubt around her. The race to find Jessica was no longer just about uncovering the past. It was about saving her own future, her own sanity, before Ethan convinced everyone, including her husband, that she was the one who couldn't be trusted. Ethan's veiled threat was the final push Clara needed. The passive waiting was over. They had to be more aggressive. She called Maya that night, her voice low and urgent, and relayed the conversation. "He knows," Clara whispered, pacing the floor of her bedroom while Mark was in the shower. "He suspects I'm looking into things. He's building a wall around himself, Maya, and he's trying to box me in. It means we're getting close." Maya's voice was calm and steady, a welcome anchor in Clara's sea of panic. "It means he's scared. We just need to keep pushing. I've been hitting brick walls with Jessica. Her digital footprint just stops a few days after the accident. Phone disconnected. Social media deleted. It's a textbook case of someone going off the grid." Clara sank onto the edge of her bed, her mind racing. A ghost. How do you find a ghost? She tried to think back to the months Jessica had worked for them. The conversations they'd had were mostly superficial, about the weather, about Leo. But Jessica had been a talker. What had she talked about? "Wait," Clara said slowly, a fuzzy memory beginning to sharpen. Her mother. She used to talk about her mother being sick. She lived upstate, in a small town. Jessica sent most of her paycheck home to help with medical bills. A small town Maya's interest was piqued. "Do you remember the name?" Clara closed her eyes, forcing herself to recall the snippets of conversation. Something with a river in it. Cold River, Stone River. She snapped her fingers. Mill River. That was it. A tiny place called Mill River. This was the key Maya had been missing. It was a detail no database could have provided. A human detail. "Clara, you're brilliant," Maya said, the excitement evident in her voice. "That narrows it down immensely. Give me 24 hours. The next day was the longest of Clara's life. She went through the motions with Leo, her mind miles away. Every time the phone buzzed, her heart leaped into her throat. Ethan sent a text. "Thinking of you guys, hope you have a peaceful day." And it felt like a taunt. Finally, late that afternoon, Maya called back. "I found her," she said, and Clara almost dropped the phone. "Where? How?" "It wasn't easy," Maya explained. I started by searching public records for anyone with the last name Perez in Mill River. I found her mother's address. I called the local hospital, pretending to be from an old employment agency trying to verify a reference, and confirmed her mother was a patient there. Then, I started looking at surrounding towns. Cross-referencing payroll data I could access for anyone named Jessica Perez, who started a new job in the last 3 months. The methodical process sounded like something from a movie, and Clara pressed, "And I got a hit," Maya said, a note of triumph in her voice. Jessica Perez is working as a waitress at a place called the Corner Diner in a town called Oakhaven, about 30 miles from Mill River. It's a low-profile, cash-heavy job, perfect for someone who doesn't want to be found. She's trying to stay close to her mom, but far enough away to disappear. Clara's legs felt weak. After all the suspicion and fear, they had a location, a target. Jessica was no longer a ghost. She was a real person in a real place. "What do we do now?" Clara asked, her voice trembling. "We go to her," Maya said simply. "But you have to be the one to talk to her. Clara, this has to come from you. I'll be right there with you. But she needs to see you. She needs to see Leo's mother." A wave of fear washed over Clara, but it was quickly replaced by determination. Maya was right. This was her fight. She thought of Leo, sleeping peacefully in his crib, his future hanging in the balance. She thought of Ethan's cold, threatening eyes. When she asked, "Tomorrow," Maya replied, "Mark has that all-day conference in the city. Your mother-in-law is watching Leo. It's the perfect window. I'll pick you up at 9 a.m. We're going to Oakhaven." The search was over. The confrontation was about to begin. Clara knew that whatever happened tomorrow in that small-town diner, nothing would ever be the same again. The drive to Oakhaven was thick with a nervous silence. Maya drove, her hands steady on the wheel, her expression focused. Clara sat in the passenger seat, the velvet pouch containing the cufflink feeling like a burning coal in her purse. She rehearsed the conversation in her head 100 times, but the words felt clumsy and inadequate. How do you ask someone to detonate a bomb in the middle of your life? Oakhaven was a small, sleepy town that looked like it hadn't changed in 30 years. The Corner Diner was exactly as one might picture it, a low-slung building with a faded sign, large plate glass windows, and a handful of pickup trucks parked outside. It smelled of coffee and fried bacon. The mundane setting made Clara's mission feel all the more surreal. They slid into a booth in the back, their eyes scanning the room, and then Clara saw her. Jessica Perez looked older than Clara remembered. Her shoulders were slumped with a weary resignation, and there were dark circles under her eyes. She moved between tables with a practiced, joyless efficiency, her smile for the customers never quite reaching her eyes. She was a woman, carrying a heavy weight. Clara's heart pounded. "That's her," she whispered. "Wait until she's on a break," Maya advised, her voice low. "We don't want a scene." They ordered coffee. They didn't drink, and waited. After 15 minutes, Jessica disappeared into the back, and a moment later came out the side door into an alley, pulling a cigarette from her apron. This was their chance. "I'll stay here," Maya said. "Go. You can do this." With trembling legs, Clara slid out of the booth and walked out the side door. The air in the alley was cool. Jessica was leaning against the brick wall, her head tilted back, smoke curling from her lips. She didn't notice Clara until she was only a few feet away. When her eyes finally focused on Clara, the recognition was instantaneous. The color drained from her face. The cigarette fell from her fingers. Forgotten. "Mrs. Miller," she gasped, her voice a strangled whisper. What are you doing here?" "Hello, Jessica," Clara said, her own voice surprisingly steady. "I need to talk to you." "I can't," Jessica said immediately, shaking her head, her eyes wide with panic. She started to push herself off the wall, to retreat back inside. "I have to get back to work. You shouldn't be here." "It's about Leo," Clara said, and the name stopped Jessica in her tracks. Her shoulders sagged, and she looked trapped. "It's about the day he fell. I told the police everything," Jessica stammered, wringing her hands. "It was an accident. I just turned my back for a second. It was a terrible, terrible accident." She was reciting a script. the words tumbling out as if she'd practiced them 1,000 times. Clara knew that simple denial would be her first line of defense. It was time. She reached into her purse, her fingers closing around the velvet pouch. "Then maybe you can explain this," she said, her voice dropping. She opened her hand and revealed the broken, silver cufflink with its elegant E. "I found this under the rug in the nursery. You told the police you were alone in the room with Leo." The sight of the cufflink shattered Jessica's composure completely. A choked sob escaped her lips, and she stared at the piece of metal as if it were a venomous snake. The lie was exposed. There was nowhere left for her to hide. Clara saw her chance and softened her tone, her own voice thick with emotion. "Jessica, please, look at me. I'm not here to get you in trouble. My son. My beautiful baby boy can't move his legs. He may never walk. Every single day. I have to live with that." She took a step closer, her gaze pleading. "You have a mother you care for. You know what it's like to love someone, to want to protect them. I just need to know the truth. For my son. He deserves the truth about what happened to him." The appeal worked. Jessica's face crumpled, and the carefully constructed dam of her composure burst. Tears streamed down her cheeks as she slid down the brick wall to sit on the grimy pavement. He was there. She sobbed, her voice muffled by her hands. "Mr. Ethan." He was there. Clara knelt in front of her, her heart aching with a mixture of vindication and horror. "What happened?" "Jessica, tell me everything." Through ragged breaths, the story came out. Ethan had shown up that day unannounced, while Mark was on a business call in his home office. He and Mark had a vicious argument in the hallway, right outside the nursery. Jessica had heard them shouting about money, about some investment that had gone bad, with Ethan demanding Mark fix it. Mark had refused, and the argument ended with him storming into his office and slamming the door. "Mr. Ethan." He was so angry. Jessica cried. "He came into the nursery. He told me to get out, that he wanted a moment with his nephew. I was scared. I'd never seen him like that. So I left the room. I just stood in the hall." She didn't see what happened next. She only heard a sudden, sharp thud, and then a strange, choked cry from Leo that was cut off abruptly. When Ethan came out of the room moments later, his face was pale, his eyes wild. He had told her the baby had fallen, that it was a tragic accident, and that for the sake of the family, she had to say she was the only one there. "He gave me money," she confessed, her voice barely a whisper. $10,000. All the money in the world to me. He said it was to help with my mother, but that I had to leave. I had to disappear, and never, ever say that he was there or that he had argued with his brother. I was so scared. I took the money and I ran. Clara stared at her, the pieces clicking into place with sickening clarity. The motive an argument about money. The opportunity being alone in the room. The cover-up a terrified nanny paid to lie. She had her confession, and the truth was 1,000 times uglier than she had ever imagined. The drive back from Oakhaven was a blur. Jessica's tear-streaked face and choked confession replayed in Clara's mind on a loop. The truth was a physical weight, pressing down on her, making it hard to breathe. Ethan's rage, the argument over money. His deliberate clearing of the room, it was a sequence of events that led to only one possible, horrifying conclusion. "Her testimony is huge," Maya said, her voice cutting through Clara's daze. She was already in journalist mode, strategizing. But a defense attorney will tear her apart. They'll say she's an unreliable witness, that she's making it up for money or revenge. We have the why now, Clara, but we still need the how. We need something more than a scared nanny's testimony. Clara knew she was right. They had a powerful story, but it wasn't yet irrefutable proof. When she arrived home, her mother-in-law was waiting, her face a mixture of relief and worry. Mark had just gotten back from his conference, but the atmosphere in the house was not calm. Mark was standing by the back door, his arms crossed, his face a mask of frustration. "Clara, thank God you're here. I don't know what is wrong with this dog," he said, his voice tight with annoyance. Clara's eyes followed his gaze into the garden. Buddy was a whirlwind of frantic energy. He was on the stone patio, digging obsessively at one of the loose flagstones at the edge. His paws were muddy, and he was whining with a desperate, high-pitched sound. "He's been doing this for the last hour," Mark said, exasperated. "I've tried everything commands, treats, pulling him away. He just goes right back to it. He's going to tear his paws up." Clara walked to the door, her shock from the confession momentarily forgotten, replaced by a surge of adrenaline. Mark saw a disobedient puppy, but Clara, whose entire world had been cracked open by this very dog's instincts, saw something else entirely. She saw a purpose. This was the same relentless desperation Buddy had shown when blocking Ethan from the nursery. It wasn't mischief. It was a message. "Leave him," Clara said, her voice firm. Mark stared at her. "What, Clara? He's wrecking the garden." "Just let me," she said, walking past him and into the garden. She knelt beside the frantic puppy. "What is it?" "Buddy, what did you find?" The dog whined again, digging with renewed vigor, looking from the stone to Clara, his eyes begging her to understand, trusting the instinct that had led her this far. Clara placed her hands on the edge of the flagstone. It was loose, just as Mark had said. Using all her strength, she wiggled it back and forth, the gravel scraping beneath it. Finally, she was able to pry it up and flip it over. Underneath, nestled in the dark, damp earth, was a small rectangular object wrapped tightly in a plastic grocery bag. Mark fell silent beside her. "What on earth is that?" Clara's heart was hammering so loudly she could hear it in her ears. With trembling hands, she reached into the shallow hole and picked up the package. She tore away the dirt-caked plastic. Inside was the receiver for their baby monitor. She stared at it, memories flooding back. It had gone missing right after the accident. In the chaos and trauma of those first few weeks, they had barely noticed, assuming it had been lost in the shuffle or accidentally thrown away. They had simply bought a new one, but it hadn't been lost. It had been hidden. She turned it over in her hands. The screen was cracked, a spider web of fractures across the small display, as if it had been slammed against something hard. But the body of the device, and the small memory card slot on its side, seemed intact. The baby monitor, the receiver's counterpart, the camera, was always on in the nursery. Always. It recorded video and audio. Clara stood up slowly, her gaze locking with Mark's confused face. "Ethan," she breathed, the name tasting like poison. He didn't just pay the nanny to lie. He tried to get rid of the only other witness. He had taken it from the nursery. He must have tried to smash it, panicked when it wouldn't break completely, and in a desperate act of concealment, buried it here, under a loose stone, thinking it would never be found. He had tried to destroy the evidence, but in his panic, he had only preserved it. Mark looked from the broken monitor in Clara's hand to the panting, muddy dog at her feet, and finally back to his wife's face, which was illuminated by a terrifying, absolute certainty. The foundation of his reality was beginning to crack. Clara clutched the receiver to her chest. This was it. This was the irrefutable proof Maya had said they needed. The little plastic box in her hands didn't just hold data. It held a voice. It held a memory. It held the truth of what happened in that room. A truth that a loyal, unbelievable puppy had refused to let stay buried. Mark stared at the cracked baby monitor in Clara's hands, his face a canvas of disbelief and confusion. "I don't understand," he said, his voice weak. "Why would Ethan bury our baby monitor?" "Because it was a witness," Clara said, her own voice shaking with the force of her discovery. She quickly recounted the confession from Jessica, the argument about money, Ethan's rage, his presence in the nursery. He thought he destroyed it. "Mark, but he just hid the evidence for us." Mark shook his head, a gesture of pure denial. No. Jessica is lying. Ethan. He loves Leo. He wouldn't. The words died in his throat. The chain of evidence was becoming too strong to dismiss, but the implication was too monstrous for him to accept. Clara's first call was to Maya. She explained everything in a torrent of breathless words. Jessica's confession, Buddy's discovery, the broken monitor. "Don't do anything," Maya commanded, her voice sharp and focused. "Don't try to turn it on. Don't take the memory card out. The data could be fragile. We need a professional." Mark, listening to the conversation, looked pale and sick. The world he knew, the family he trusted, was crumbling around him with every word Clara spoke. The next afternoon, they found themselves in a place that felt a world away from their quiet suburban life, the small, cluttered office of a digital forensics expert named Ben. He was a contact of Maya's, a man who specialized in recovering data from damaged devices for sensitive legal cases. He was discreet, quiet, and exuded an air of calm competence that did little to soothe Clara's frayed nerves. The three of them, Clara, a silent and ashen-faced Mark, and a supportive Maya, sat on uncomfortable chairs as Ben examined the monitor and carefully extracted the small micro SD card. "The device itself is shot," Ben said, peering at the card through a magnifying lamp. "And there's visible damage to the card. It looks like it was hit with significant force. I can try to bypass the damaged sectors, but I can't promise anything. The video files, with their larger size, are almost certainly a lost cause. But audio is smaller, more resilient. There might be a fragment." The wait was agonizing. Ben worked at his computer, the room filled only with the soft clicking of his keyboard and the hum of his equipment. Clara held Mark's hand. It was cold and clammy. He hadn't spoken a word since they'd arrived, his eyes fixed on Ben's screen, his face a mask of dread. He was a man waiting for his own execution, after what felt like an eternity. Ben swiveled in his chair. "Okay," he said softly. "I've got something." Clara's heart stopped. "Like I thought. The video is gone. Irretrievable," he explained. "But I managed to pull a single corrupted audio file. It's only 4 seconds long. From the very end of the recording, right before the card was damaged and the power was cut." He looked at them, his expression grim. "It's not clean. There's a lot of static. Are you ready to hear it?" Clara nodded, unable to speak. Mark looked like he was going to be sick, but he gave a single, jerky nod. Ben clicked his mouse. The sound that filled the small office was horrifying. First, there was a layer of scratchy static, but underneath it, a voice was terrifyingly clear. It was Ethan's voice, not the charming, smooth tone they were used to, but a snarl of pure, guttural rage. "It should have been mine." The words hung in the air, dripping with venomous greed. They were followed immediately by a sound that made Clara flinch, a sickening, heavy thud. It wasn't loud, but it was dense and final. And then, the sound that shattered Mark's world completely. It was Leo's cry. Not a fussy, tired cry, but a sharp, piercing wail of pure pain. A sound of shock and agony that lasted for a single, heartbreaking second before it was abruptly, unnaturally cut off. Then, silence. The audio file ended, but the sound echoed in the room, in their minds. Clara let out a strangled gasp, her hand flying to her mouth as tears streamed down her face. It was the sound every parent dreads, the sound of their child in true pain. Maya reached over and squeezed her shoulder, her own face pale with shock. But it was Mark's reaction that was the most devastating. He made a low, wounded sound, like an animal in a trap. The last vestiges of his denial were annihilated by the undeniable proof of his son's suffering at the hands of his own brother. He doubled over in his chair, his head in his hands, and a deep, ragged sob was torn from his chest. It was the sound of a man whose heart, whose trust, whose entire life had just been irrevocably broken. The horrifying truth was no longer a suspicion or a testimony. It was a 4-second recording, a permanent, damning echo in the silence. The drive home from the forensics expert's office was a journey through a vacuum. The bustling city sounds faded into a dull roar, unheard and unheeded. Maya drove, her knuckles white on the steering wheel, her expression a mask of grim determination. In the back seat, Clara held Mark's hand, but he was unreachable, lost in the echoing horror of the 4-second audio file. He stared out the window, but his eyes saw nothing. He was a man hollowed out, the entire foundation of his life, his trust in his brother, his belief in a tragic accident demolished in a single, brutal moment. When they got home, the silence followed them inside. Mark walked into the living room like a sleepwalker and sank onto the sofa. For a long moment, he just sat there, his body rigid. Buddy, sensing the profound shift in the atmosphere, came over and rested his head on Mark's knee, whining softly. That small act of comfort seemed to be the key that unlocked the floodgates. A strangled sound tore from Mark's throat, and he buried his face in his hands. The sobs that followed were not quiet or restrained. They were the raw, agonizing sounds of a man whose soul was breaking apart. It was a storm of grief, rage, and a betrayal so deep it was an amputation. My son. He choked out, the words mangled by his weeping. My little boy. His own brother. His own brother. Clara knelt in front of him, her own tears flowing freely. Her anger had carried her this far. A cold, hard shield against the pain. But seeing her husband so completely shattered brought the agony rushing back. This was the true cost of Ethan's greed. It wasn't just a child's body that had been broken, but a family's heart. She let him grieve, holding him, anchoring him as the storm raged. When the violent sobs finally subsided into shuddering breaths, she began to talk. She told him everything, starting from the very beginning. She told him about the first flicker of doubt sparked by Buddy's growl, the discovery of the cufflink, her meeting with Maya. She detailed every word of Jessica's confession, painting the full, sordid picture of Ethan's rage and the subsequent cover-up. She laid out the evidence, piece by damning piece, not to convince him anymore, but to ground him in the terrible, undeniable reality they now shared. He listened, his head still in his hands, his tears dripping onto the floor. When she was finished, he finally looked up. The grief was still there, a gaping wound in his eyes, but underneath it, something new was forming, something cold and hard and dangerous. It was the same fury that had been fueling Clara for weeks. They were finally on the same side, united in their heartbreak and their anger. What do we do? He asked, his voice a raw whisper. Maya says we have enough to go to the police, Clara said softly. The audio file, Jessica's testimony. They will have to open an investigation. Mark was silent for a long time, his jaw working. No, he finally said, his voice low and firm. Not yet. Clara looked at him, surprised. The police. That's for later, he continued, his eyes meeting hers. They were full of a chilling resolve. This is family. This is my brother. Before the law gets him, I need to look him in the eye. I need to see his face when he hears that recording. I need him to answer to me. Clara understood completely. This wasn't just about legal justice. This was about a personal reckoning. It was about forcing a monster to face the lives he had destroyed. He has to confess, Mark said, his voice gaining strength. I want to hear him say it. A plan began to form, a grim strategy for the final act. They would not let Ethan know they were coming for him. They would lure him into their home, the very scene of his crime, under a guise of normalcy. They would confront him together, armed with their arsenal of secrets. I'll call him tomorrow, Mark said, a cold fire replacing the tears in his eyes. I'll tell him we need to talk about setting up a new trust for Leo's long-term care. Money. That's the only thing he understands. He'll come. Clara nodded, her own resolve hardening. The battle lines were drawn. They were no longer a grieving, fractured couple. They were a united front, poised to confront the architect of their pain. They would set a trap, baited with the very greed that had caused their nightmare. And they would wait for the monster to walk into it. The next morning, Mark made the call. Clara sat beside him, listening, her hand resting on his knee. He held the phone to his ear, his face a stony mask, his voice eerily calm as he left a message for his brother. Ethan, it's Mark. Listen, Clara and I have been talking. We need to set up a more permanent trust for Leo's care, something substantial. I'd like to get your input on the financial structure. Can you come over tonight around 7? We need to sort this out. It was the perfect bait, an appeal to Ethan's greed and his desire to be seen as the family's financial guru. As expected, Ethan called back within the hour, his voice dripping with faux concern and enthusiasm. Of course, Mark. Anything for Leo. I'll be there at 7. The rest of the day passed in a blur of tense anticipation. The house was quiet, but it was the charged stillness of the air before a lightning strike. Leo was with Clara's parents for the night. The only other occupant was Buddy, who seemed to feel the shift in the atmosphere. He paced restlessly, a low, anxious whine in his throat, his eyes darting between Mark and Clara. He knew a confrontation was coming. At 6:55 p.m. Headlights swept across the living room window. Mark stood up, his body rigid. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs. They were ready. The broken cufflink lay on the coffee table, next to the small digital audio player Ben had given them. The damning 4-second file, loaded and ready. The doorbell rang. Mark opened the door, his expression unreadable. Ethan strode in, smiling, holding a bottle of expensive wine. For the hard-working parents, he announced cheerfully. I figured we could use it after all this dreary financial talk. Thank you, Ethan, Clara said, her voice tight. Come in. Ethan's smile faltered slightly as he entered the living room. The air was cold, sterile. Buddy stood at the far end of the room, the fur on his neck raised, a low, menacing growl rumbling in his chest. Ethan shot the dog a look of annoyance. That dog, he muttered, before turning his attention back to them. So, a trust fund. A wise move. Let's sit down and... There is no trust fund. Ethan, Mark said, his voice cutting through the air like glass. Ethan stopped, his smile vanishing. He looked from Mark's cold face to Clara's. What's going on? You both look like you've seen a ghost. We have, Clara said, her voice trembling with suppressed rage. The ghost of the truth. Ethan let out a short, nervous laugh. Okay, what is this? An intervention. I told you I was worried about you two. The stress is clearly getting to you. He was already falling back on his pre-written script, casting them as the unstable ones. We spoke to Jessica, Mark said flatly. The color drained from Ethan's face. For the first time, a flicker of genuine panic flashed in his eyes. The nanny. What about her? She was a flighty, unreliable girl. She told us you were here that day. Ethan, Clara said, taking a step forward. She told us you argued with Mark about money. She told us you sent her out of the nursery right before Leo fell. She pointed to the coffee table. She also helped us identify this. You left it behind. Ethan's eyes darted to the broken cufflink. His composure shattered. He began to stammer. That could have been from any time. She's lying. She's a liar trying to extort you. She isn't the only one who remembers. Ethan, Mark said, his voice dangerously low. He picked up the audio player. We also found the baby monitor you tried to destroy. A guttural sound of pure terror escaped Ethan's throat. His eyes were wide, fixed on the small device in his brother's hand. He knew what it was. He knew what it held. We know what you did, Mark said, his voice breaking with a fresh wave of pain and fury. Now you're going to listen to it. He pressed play. The scratchy audio filled the silent room. Ethan's enraged voice. It should have been mine, followed by the sickening thud. And then the sound that had become the soundtrack to their nightmares. Leo's sharp cry of pain, cut short. In that moment, the monster was unmasked. Ethan's face contorted into a snarl of pure panic and rage. The facade of the charming brother, the concerned uncle, was burned away, revealing the curdled, entitled creature beneath. No, he screamed, and he lunged, not for the door, but for the audio player. His intention clear to smash the evidence once and for all. But Mark was ready. Fueled by a father's righteous fury, he met Ethan head-on. The two brothers crashed to the floor in a tangle of limbs. The wine bottle Ethan had brought smashed against the hearth, red wine spilling across the floor like blood. You ruined everything, Ethan shrieked, struggling against Mark's hold. He was never supposed to get it all. That money, that inheritance. It was ours, Mark. Your pathetic, weak son got in the way of our future. It was a full confession, screamed in a torrent of rage. As he fought, Clara, her hands shaking, pulled out her phone and dialed 911. Her voice clear and steady as she spoke to the dispatcher. I need the police. My brother-in-law has just confessed to harming my child. Mark, with a surge of strength, pinned his struggling brother to the floor. He looked down at the face of the man he had once loved, now twisted into a mask of pure hatred, and felt nothing but a cold, empty finality. The house of lies had finally come crashing down, and as the distant, rising wail of sirens grew closer, Ethan stopped fighting. He lay on the floor, panting, a trapped animal, the sound of his own defeat echoing in his ears. The arrival of the police was swift and efficient. The flashing red and blue lights painted the walls of the living room, casting a surreal glow on the scene of domestic carnage. Ethan, limp and defeated, didn't resist as he was pulled to his feet, handcuffed, and read his rights. He didn't look at Mark or Clara as he was led out of the house, his face a stony mask of self-pity. The monster had been caged. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of legal proceedings. Lawyers, police statements, and the horrified, heartbroken reactions of their family, especially Mark's parents, who now had to face the unthinkable reality that one of their sons had monstrously betrayed the other. The media caught wind of the story, the wealthy family, the tragic accident that was really a crime of greed, but Clara and Mark walled themselves off from it all. Their focus was singular, their world now condensed to their small, broken family and the long, slow process of healing. With Ethan gone and the truth exposed, a profound change settled over their home. The oppressive, suffocating silence that had haunted the rooms for months finally lifted. It was as if a toxic cloud had dissipated, allowing sunlight to filter in for the first time. The house was still quiet, but it was a peaceful quiet now, filled not with unspoken secrets, but with the soft sounds of life, Leo's gurgles, the gentle click of Buddy's nails on the hardwood floor, and the quiet, easy conversations between a husband and wife who were slowly finding their way back to each other. Their care for Leo transformed as well. The daily physical therapy sessions were no longer a grim duty steeped in hopeless sorrow. Now, they were acts of defiance, of hope, of reclamation. Every small stretch, every gentle massage, was a step away from Ethan's crime and a step toward their son's future. It was Maya who provided the next crucial step. Through her research for the story, she had come across a pioneering neurological rehabilitation center in another state, known for its work with children with spinal cord injuries. It was run by a Dr. Eris Thorne, a specialist who used aggressive, innovative therapies to try and reestablish neural pathways. Clara and Mark flew there, their hearts filled with a cautious, fragile hope. Dr. Thorne was realistic. He offered no miracles, no false promises of a cure. The damage is severe, he told them, after a series of thorough examinations. But Leo is young. His brain is incredibly plastic. We can't reverse the injury, but we may be able to teach his body to create new pathways around it. It will be a long, grueling, process. Years of intensive therapy, and the gains, if any, will be incremental. He paused, his gaze meeting theirs. But there is a chance. A small one. But it's there. A chance for some improvement. A chance. After months of being told there was no hope, the word itself was a balm. It was everything. They enrolled Leo in the program without a second thought. Back home, as they prepared for this new chapter, a deep sense of gratitude settled over them. One evening, Clara and Mark were on the floor with Leo, who was lying on his playmate. Buddy was stretched out beside him, his furry golden body a constant warm presence. The puppy rested his head near Leo's small and still legs, just as he always did. Mark reached out and stroked Buddy's head, his touch full of a reverence that hadn't been there before. He knew, Mark said quietly, his voice thick with awe. From the very beginning, he knew something was wrong. I thought he was just being a difficult puppy. He shook his head, a sad smile touching his lips. He's the hero in this story, isn't he? Clara leaned her head on Mark's shoulder, watching her son reach out a hand to grasp a fistful of Buddy's soft fur. He's more than that, she said softly. He's the guardian who showed up when we needed him most. He's family. The storm had passed, the wreckage was all around them, and the scars would remain forever. But the truth had set them free. A new dawn was breaking, not one of a magical, perfect life, but one of hard-won hope, honest effort, and the unshakable love between a boy and the unbelievable dog who refused to let him be a silent victim. Their real journey was just beginning. The silence was a distant memory. The house was now filled with a different set of sounds, the steady, rhythmic whir of a pediatric therapy machine, the encouraging words of a visiting therapist, and, most importantly, the bright, infectious laughter of a little boy. The journey had been arduous. The intensive therapy regimen was demanding, pushing Leo and his parents to their limits. There were days of frustration and exhaustion, moments when progress seemed impossible, but they never gave up, united by their shared purpose. Clara and Mark became a formidable team, celebrating every tiny victory with a gratitude that was fierce and profound. Leo, now a toddler, was a testament to the power of resilience. The paralysis below his waist remained a permanent part of his reality, but Dr. Thorne's prediction had come true. Through sheer force of will and countless hours of work, Leo's body had begun to find new ways. He had regained significant core strength. The monumental victory came 6 months into their new regimen, a moment seared into Clara's memory forever. Leo, using his strong little arms, had pushed himself from a lying position into a seated one, all by himself. He had sat there, a look of pure triumph on his face, a king surveying his domain. He was a happy, determined child, his world one of bright toys, colorful books, and the constant, loving presence of his parents. And, of course, his shadow. Buddy was no longer a clumsy puppy, but a handsome, full-grown golden retriever, his coat the color of spun gold. His official role was now Leo's therapy assistant and best friend. He would lie patiently by Leo's side during exercises, offering a soft ear to be tugged for encouragement. When Leo, in his custom-made walker, practiced moving his legs with the help of braces and supports, Buddy would walk alongside him, matching his pace, nudging a dropped toy back into his reach. The final scene of their old life had played out in a courtroom. Ethan, faced with the undeniable audio evidence and Jessica's testimony, was found guilty. He was serving a long sentence, a bitter, forgotten man whose greed had cost him everything. His name was never spoken in their home. He was a ghost of a past they had survived. This evening, the family was in the garden. The sun was setting, casting long, warm shadows across the lawn. The flagstone that had once hidden a terrible secret was now part of a beautiful, thriving patio garden Clara had planted. It was a space of life, not lies. Leo was sitting on a thick blanket, his back straight and strong. He was throwing a soft, red ball, his aim clumsy but full of delight. Buddy would catch it gently in his mouth, trot back, and drop it in Leo's lap, his tail wagging in a constant, joyful rhythm. Clara and Mark sat on a bench nearby, watching. Mark's arm was wrapped around Clara's shoulders, and she leaned her head against him, a sense of profound peace settling over her. This was their life now. It wasn't the life they had once dreamed of, but in many ways, it was richer. It was a life forged in fire, stripped of all pretense, and rebuilt on a foundation of truth, courage, and an unbreakable love. Leo let out a peal of pure, unadulterated laughter as Buddy licked his face. He wrapped his arms around the dog's neck, burying his face in his soft fur. Clara's eyes filled with tears, but for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, they were tears of pure, unblemished joy. Her family was whole. Her son was happy. Her hero was home.